Hi, this is Pat Johnson, your psychology instructor, and in this mini lecture we're going to continue our discussion of memory, and we're going to go more deeply into that second track on our three-stage model and talk about explicit memory. So here's our three-stage model, and our first stage in our three-stage model is sensory memory. So to get information into sensory memory, we have to have external events. In other words, something going on in our environment. Something we could see, something we could taste, something we could touch, something we can hear. Some external stimuli is going in to sensory memory. There has to be some type of sensory input. And it goes into sensory memory, and that is our first stage. It contains sensory information. It has a huge capacity, so everything you can sense goes into that first stage of sensory memory. Its downfall is that it's very brief. It's about a half a second for visual information and only about 2 to 3 seconds for auditory information. After about half a second for visual information or 2 to 3 seconds for auditory information, two things could happen. Either we dump it and we forget it, or it could go this route and go on to the next stage, which is working or short-term memory. The only way we can encode information into working or short-term memory is to pay attention. Okay, so we have to have attention to important or novel information. Most information is dumped from sensory memory. Imagine if you were going through life where everything you could sense was going further into your memory. That would be really difficult. But we do certainly want some of the information to go into our short-term memory. Now let's take a look at two scenarios. In this case, this student here is not moving information from sensory memory to short-term memory because he's not paying attention. You have to pay attention for encoding to occur. These students, on the other hand, are engaged. They're obviously listening to the instructor. They're participating. So information is at least going to go to short-term memory and possibly even deeper. But this guy here, he's there physically, but that information that he may be hearing is just going right from sensory memory and getting dumped right out. All right, let's suppose we've paid attention to information and now that information is going into working or short-term memory. Either of those names are fine. Short-term memory, and we abbreviate short-term memory STM, has its own characteristics also. It involves conscious processing, and by conscious processing we mean that thinking about it, paying attention to it. What is in your short-term memory is what you are thinking about at this moment in time, what you are conscious of. It has limited capacity. A guy by the name of George Miller did some research on the capacity of short-term memory. Capacity means how much, and he came up with this 7 plus or minus 2. So 7 minus 2 is 5, 7 plus 2 is 9, so about 5 to 9 pieces of information is the capacity of short-term memory. And we can show that very easily. Let's suppose I read off the numbers 5, 7, 2, 6, 3, 4. Many of you are probably repeating that, and you're able to hold that in your short-term memory, and you can think it or say it out loud now. And if you got 5, 7, 2, 6, 3, 4, which is 6 pieces of information, you're showing normal short-term memory. That's within the 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information. If I went further and read off a much larger number, Let's suppose it had 15 digits or 16 digits or something like that. Most of you would find it very difficult to hold that amount in your short-term memory. You could, however, use chunking, and we use chunking when we remember our social security number. We use chunking if we remember any phone numbers, although very few people do that anymore. But chunking means to put the information into meaningful units. For example, I remember my social security number by knowing 3, and then 2, and then 4. Short-term memory is about 18 seconds long. So after 18 seconds, if I had asked you to repeat those 6 digits, unless that information had gone down deeper into long-term memory, you probably didn't know that information because you had not kept it in short-term memory past that 18 seconds. If you continued to think about it, though, and if you sat there going 572634, 572634, 572634, what you're doing is maintenance rehearsal, and you're stretching that information out past that 18 seconds. Let's take a look at chunking. Let's suppose I read this number off to you. Most of you would not be able to keep that number in your short-term memory because it's just too many pieces of information. However, if I read this off to you, 0194118121776, and you organized it in this way, 0, 1941, 1812, 1776. Well, it's the exact same digits, but this is only 4 pieces of information, and that's below George Miller's magic number of 7 plus or minus 2, or his magic range, I should say. And not only are these 4 pieces of information, you should know these as important dates in American history. So that's chunking, and it's a much better way of remembering pieces of information by chunking it into meaningful units. All right, to move information from short-term memory to long-term memory, we have encoding a second time. Remember, we had encoding here where we paid attention to our information. Now we're encoding information from short-term memory into long-term memory. And here's the trick of short-term memory, of getting information from short-term memory and into long-term memory. We need to encode and retrieve it numerous times. In other words, put it in and take it out, and put it in and take it out, and put it in and take it out. So let's suppose on every lecture, every time we talked about something, I said 572634. Pretty soon, because you've been putting 572634 in and out and in and out many times, you're taking that information from short-term memory and you're putting it into long-term memory. And here's a visual depiction of it. Imagine walking through a forest. You've walked through once, you didn't leave a trace. It's going to be very hard to find your exact same path the next time. On the other hand, if you go through the forest if you go over the exact same path here, you're going to be able to find your way again. That's a good depiction of what we're doing here with encoding and retrieving. We're forming not a path through a woods, but we're forming a neural pathway. Now let's go to long-term memory, this last box here. Long-term memory, for all intent and purposes, has unlimited capacity. I know when you're studying for tests, you may feel like you cannot shove another piece of information into long-term memory, but you can. Even if you live to be very, very old, you can still be a lifelong learner and keep putting stuff into long-term memory. There is a question about whether or not long-term memory is permanent, and there are arguments here by cognitive psychologists. Some cognitive psychologists say that yes, We can dump stuff from long-term memory, just like we can dump stuff from sensory memory. And if we don't encode short-term memory into long-term memory, we can dump stuff here. So some psychologists say stuff can be dumped from long-term memory. Others say, no, it's there. If it ever was there, it is still there. We just may have a problem retrieving it, where it's very hard to get it out from long-term memory. So that's the basics of the three-box model. Again, we have external events of sensory information. It goes into sensory memory, which is very brief, about a half a second for visual information and 2 to 3 seconds for auditory information. Sensory memory has a huge capacity of sensory information. If we pay attention to it, we can encode it into short-term or working memory. Short-term or working memory is what's in your mind right now. It involves conscious processing. It only can hold about 5 to 9 pieces of information. George Miller found that out with his famous 7 plus or minus 2. And it's only about 18 seconds long. After 18 seconds, we either have to keep repeating the information to stretch that information out, or it gets dumped, or we put it into long-term memory. Long-term memory has unlimited capacity. It has a huge capacity. There's still an argument about whether or not it's permanent, and long-term memory is organized and indexed, meaning we have somewhat of an organization to our long-term memory. Things are linked to other things. So let's suppose you're in a seated class and you remember that class that day. You're going to remember maybe people. You could also remember topics. You may remember the physical environment, the room. And those memories are linked to other memories, which are linked to other memories, which are linked to other memories. So those are, that is the way long-term memory is organized and indexed. So take my advice, and as you study, keep putting information in over and over, and you're going to make a much more durable long-term memory.